What's up, everybody? This is Caleb Rundell, and this is your video for Acts chapter 11. So, Acts chapter 11 is a direct follow-on from what happens in chapter 10. There's some fallout and some pushback, and then some good news about Peter's experience in chapter 10 of Gentiles, Cornelius and his household receiving the gospel and the Holy Spirit. All that happens in chapter 10. Jewish Christians in Jerusalem have some things to say about that. For most of the chapter, Peter just recounts the story from chapter 10, which which tells us how important chapter 10 is, whatever word choice works there. In verse 17, Peter gets to the point where he says, if God gives gifts, if God is doing something, who am I to hinder that, regardless of what my beliefs are or aren't? So that's most of chapter 11. Now, some things happen after that. In verse 19, the action moves north. It talks about believers being dispersed following the prosecution of Stephen. It mentions Antioch, which is in southeast Turkey. Phoenicia is what we would now consider modern-day Lebanon, and Cyprus is still called Cyprus, an island there in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyrene, mentioned in verse 20, is modern-day Libya, there along the Mediterranean coast. In verse 21, we hear about the Hellenists again. We heard about them earlier in Acts. People who were not Greek ethnically, but were Greek culturally or linguistically. In verse 22, the church in Jerusalem sends Barnabas up to Antioch to investigate these things. And here is a map for you about the places mentioned here. Jerusalem there in the south, Antioch up in the north, and then Tarsus, where Saul/Paul, he's not Paul yet, that's coming, where Saul has been hiding out for a while in his home place of Tarsus. So Barnabas, while he's all the way there up north in Antioch, decides to go up to Tarsus with Paul, gets him, and then they spend a whole year in Antioch. And it's cool that it's mentioned here that it is here in Antioch with Saul and Barnabas that the term Christians is first used. So they're still probably called the Way, but it is in Antioch where they first describe this group of people who follow Jesus that they call in Greek the Christ, the Christos, that they are known as Christians. So that's kind of cool. Chapter 11 ends in verses 27 through 30 about talking about a famine that is prophesied and then happens, and that the church up north with Barnabas and Saul in Antioch then sends relief, most likely funds, not food, because how much food could they physically transport without it getting robbed or lost or spoiled or anything? So the church up north with Barnabas and Saul sends funds, most likely south with them, to the church in Judea and around Jerusalem. And this is a cool example of the church working together across regions to help each other out and provide tangible things, to follow those teachings from Jesus of when I was hungry, you fed me. And this follows the pattern we see about the church that was established in chapter 2 and later in chapter 4, where they have things in common, and they're now doing that as far as they can globally. Whereas first, these things were just happening locally around Jerusalem, they're trying to continue this model across regions and distances. So go early church. Things we are still doing today as much as we can to help out people around the globe when disaster strikes. Now, when it talks about a global famine here, we need to remember that for these people, the world was basically just the Mediterranean basin, up north into Northern Europe and Russia, east maybe as far as India, thinking about the adventures of Alexander the Great, and then south into the Sahara Desert and Ethiopia and into Africa. Remember that for these people, the Western world stopped after Spain and the British Isles, and then it was just ocean, and it was just uncharted and unknown lands going south and north and east, assumedly ending at some point. So when it says a worldwide famine, remember their world was much smaller than ours. Famines also fairly common. A harvest could fail anywhere. In the Roman Empire, if the harvest was bad in Egypt, where most of their grain came from, that could cause a famine. So these are not, atypical events. Famines happen fairly frequently for lots of different reasons in lots of different areas. So, in all probability, was there famine? Yes. Okay, so there you go. So here's your video for chapter 11. Some cool stuff going on here with the church helping each other out. Things happening up north in Antioch. Barnabas and Saul doing their thing. Tune in for chapter 12.